Hello. Let's start with an exercise, okay? I'm gonna give you all a symptom that could be connected to mental illness, and I wanna see if any of you can relate. So raise your hand if you've ever had trouble getting your homework done. Yeah. We could all have ADHD, or OCD, or nothing. Unfortunately for me, hating algebra was not a diagnosable mental illness. My point is, diagnoses are tricky, and we all need a licensed therapist, like myself, to help us find the most appropriate one, and to hopefully help us understand that diagnoses don't capture the complexity of what it means to be human. Diagnoses aren't an identity. They are names for a set of symptoms, and who we are is often hiding behind those symptoms. You are not your diagnosis. But I see how you all talk about diagnoses these days on TikTok. Like they're astrological signs. No one is a depressed moon with a narcissistic sun and a BPD rising, no matter what co-star tells you. I am here to challenge everyone to redefine what it means to be diagnosed, and why not to identify with it. Last year, at this very time, I was sick. And the longer the pain continued, I fell into a depression. I didn't touch my guitar for over a year. It just hung there on the wall staring at me with shame. Instead, I laid whole afternoons on the living room floor. And I tried to tell people that I was sinking, but it is still hard for us to understand illnesses that we can't see. Every once in a while, I would catch a glimmer of my essence bubble up, and I would try to grasp for it like a bobbing log in a rapid river. And I would try to catch my breath and remind myself who I was. And then I did something super cringy. I wrote, "I can do this," on a giant whiteboard. And I wrote it on a whiteboard so I could erase it. But I wrote it because I needed the me that was avoiding the pain to help me find new strategies to handle that pain. Diagnoses for clinicians and people like teachers are helpful in understanding what a client or a student is going through. They were originally created for me and not you. But many people feel seen and empowered by them. It gives them an explanation for their feelings, and sometimes even a chance at forgiveness. And we are in an incredibly exciting time in mental health. This generation's embrace of self-love and acceptance is revolutionary, and I am so proud, and I am so grateful for making people like me relevant. Therapists are the new rock star. This wasn't the case for someone like Mimi, who probably struggled with bipolar disorder her entire life, but she was never diagnosed and she was never treated. She grew up in a time where people were either institutionalized or neglected. And because of that, she suffered and she hurt the people that she loved the most. Like me, she was my grandmother. I love the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. You can see why we use the shorthand. While you all scroll your phones, I scroll the DSM. And it is essentially a map that lists all the diagnoses and all the symptoms that are associated with them. But as helpful as it is, our current methods are not yet sophisticated enough for the nuances of human psychology. The study of mental illness is 150 years old. The DSM was first published in 1952, and we're only on the 5th edition. Like any map, it is constantly evolving. Just think about a map from like 100 years ago. It probably had sea monsters drawn on it. But now we have satellite images that are so accurate, your parents can literally track you on them. I'm so sorry. It's a good thing that it's evolving, because things like homosexuality and gender identity used to be considered disorders and now have been depathologized.
This is one reason why it is crucial that you do not put your identity in the hands of a diagnosis that in your lifetime could become obsolete.
The science is ever-changing, and the mind is far from fully understood. In this era of YouTube experts and self-diagnosers, attaching labels to ourselves is dangerously easy. All the while, professionals still can't agree on whether these are brain disorders only caused by chemical imbalances or solely derived from trauma. And the relief of feeling seen by a disorder often does not outweigh the lifelong struggle of conquering something that is integrated with who you are. A cancer patient isn't cancer. In the same way that a person with schizophrenia isn't a schizophrenic.
Unless they think they are. I had a client. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and she was decompensating, which means getting worse at an alarming rate. So we met with a brilliant psychiatrist who, upon listening to her, realized it was her fusion with the diagnosis that was crippling her. And so he told her promptly he had made a huge mistake and that she was in fact not bipolar. And I was appalled.
But then, surprisingly, she became more resilient. And she found the strength to face her ghosts, practice her skills, and eventually leave treatment. It wasn't that the diagnosis was bad or wrong, it was that she couldn't make a distinction between it and herself until he took it away from her. And here's a few things you should know.
Diagnoses are a set of symptoms. I said this before. In order to qualify for one, you have to exhibit a certain number of said symptoms, which means if you reduce those symptoms, which is what we're trying to do in therapy, past a certain threshold, you no longer qualify for one. And different diagnoses share symptoms, so that makes misdiagnosing extremely common.
And another crucial flaw of the DSM is that diagnoses don't focus on where a disorder comes from. For example, an eating disorder causes maladaptive eating patterns, but it isn't inherently about eating at all. If a patient identifies with a diagnosis, they could end up with the same struggles as my grandmother Mimi. She was never diagnosed, so it overtook her. But if you identify with yours, it overtakes you, and that is a shame, because a healthy sense of self is the wellspring of resilience. Identity. That is an existential path you will always be on. It is a creative process. It is fluid. There are a few things that make up your identity, like feeling good at something,
and your values, but the core of it is your uniqueness. And I have been thinking a lot about my own identity lately. It's called turning 46. And I'm not just a therapist. I also identify as a performer. And as a performer, I sometimes build characters. And through every character, I have realized that there are aspects of them that exist inside of me. We all contain multitudes.
And the more diverse and integrated your identity, the healthier you are. This is why I feel for this generation. This mental health explosion is happening right as you're discovering yourself. You are entering, from age 12 to 19, a psychosocial stage called identity versus role confusion. It is your time to break free from your parental molds.
That is why everything we do right now seems to irk you. I'm sure my daughter is out there currently looking at me through her fingers. But this stage makes you vulnerable to believing you are something, anything, that someone else tells you you are. So here's a therapist's gentle nudge.
Be cautious about boxing yourself into a diagnosis. Embracing your diagnosis is bold and beautiful, but there is a fine line between understanding yourself and becoming one with a label.
Identity is who we are despite labels. one of my favorite tools to practice to prevent cognitive fusion with a diagnosis is to talk about it instead of you. Give it a name that you would never, ever, ever take advice from, like Belinda told me I shouldn't eat that, or Maurice wants me to give up on myself. Mine is named Mom. No, mine is named Beth, after a girl that bullied me for my looks.
Do I think that many people will have lifelong mental health struggles? Yes. Do I think that their identity is still more important? 100%. Consider it the antidote. I have been diagnosed with panic disorder, but look at me up here right now, keeping it together, kind of. Look at me, bad. But despite panic disorder being considered a serious mental illness, I identify as brave despite it.
And as a redhead, with bangs, because nothing says she's going through something like bangs do, and I almost have bangs, you know? Anyway, how do you see me? Do you see me as depression? Do you see me as panic disorder? Or as a therapist, a performer, a sometimes guitar player, having a midlife crisis? Remember, diagnoses are symptoms. They are not our stories.
For many years, people have come to my practice with negative core beliefs. For example, I am unlovable. And what we do is we challenge these beliefs that dictate who we think we are and what we think we deserve, which made me realize a diagnosis rooting itself in the core of your identity means progress stops before it even starts. We become what we believe.
That is why you have to say to yourself, this is not who I am. This is something I deal with. This is painful, but it is not me. And you are in a crucial phase that can either be a vulnerability or a superpower. Focus your identity on your uniqueness, knowing that any box will hold you back.
And my challenge for anyone with a diagnosis is to view it not as an emotional home or a life sentence, but as an illuminating jumping off point. The chance for recovery is real if you embrace your whole self. That is the greatest tool you have. Thank you.